Good evening, and welcome to my negative rebuttal for the group on Guantanamo Bay and whether or not it should be closed permanently. So, Guantanamo Bay must remain open in order to create a more stable and safe environment for the world as a whole, and especially for us in the West. My opponent pointed to the fact that 36 former detainees of Guantanamo Bay later went on to rejoin various radicalized extremist organizations that were actively engaged in terror activities. However, my opponent used this fact as a reason why it's a small number and a minority and not a big deal. However, I argue that whether or not this is an isolated incident or a minority, as my opponent has stated or not, these incidents of recidivism into these radical ideologies is the exact reason why Guantanamo Bay exists in the first place. These 36 detainees are perfect examples of why the detention center is necessary. If they were not being detained, what horrors could they have unleashed on the world at large? We know for a fact that they committed and actively engaged in acts of terrorism after leaving the facility, and the reason they were housed there to begin with is because of suspected or confirmed acts of terror against us or other people in the world. Would this not alone prove that we could have had 36, at the very least, 36 documented instances of continued terrorist attacks from at least 36 operators? It only took, less than 10 to bring down the Twin Towers on 9/11, which was, the kind of the instigation for this all to begin with. Also, my opponent has proposed sending these detainees from our facility back to their nation of origin, rather than continuing to house them at the Guantanamo Bay facility as a solvency alternative. However, there are nations, like in the case of Saudi Arabia or Iran, where these nations have no interest in punitive measures of any kind for these detainees, even if they are proven to be guilty of these said terrorist inclinations. In fact, as in the case of Iran in particular, they actively encourage and even endorse and fund terrorism around the world. If we return these prisoners suspected of committing acts of terrorism back to Iran, we would only be assuring that these criminals would be back trying to cause the destruction of the West before the week was out. This has happened numerous times since the initiation of the facility and will continue with the same trend unless we learn our lesson and decide to do something different, or to not try something different, as it were. We as a nation who has been affected by terrorism so heavily, like with 9/11, various other bombings, like the Orlando shooting, over the past few decades, cannot afford this blatant denial of the reality that is before us. Namely, not everyone in the world wants to stop terrorism. Some people in the world do not share the West's idea of civility and human rights and decency. This is why the detention center in Guantanamo is not only necessary, but justified as well. At what point does a violator of human rights, as my opponent has stated, we need to take into consideration the rights of the detainees, their human rights, above all, like make it paramount. But at what point does a violator of human rights lose the right to reciprocal rights? If we sentence someone to death or imprison them indefinitely, as is the norm for American citizens that have violated the law, do we not sentence them to death or imprison them indefinitely? And is that not also a violation of their human rights? I believe that this argument is a fallacy because the very act of imprisonment moves into the realm of violating a person's right to freedom of movement. When a person has committed heinous or violent acts towards the society as a whole, the violator has refused to abide by the said society's social contracts. Just as in all relationships and contracts, there are consequences for breaking said institutions. We need to deny a few singular individuals a portion of their rights in order to assure the preservation of the most amount of rights for the society as a whole. Unfortunately, my opponent's pleas to morality are ineffectual within this construct because the rules of engagement are greatly changed by war. Not only that, but the war on terror is one that has changed the way we look at war and engagements entirely. There's no definitive nation of origin when it comes to terror. It can come from any place and anywhere. Therefore, any advantages or safeguards that can be put in place to prevent further terror incidents should and must be implemented. Although this may raise moral qualms with some, the risk to reward ratio of what is at stake is plain to see. This is exemplified by an unjust detention may prevent the deaths or destruction of many more innocent lives. Because it is impossible to prove whether or not an incident could have happened if the detainee was not under our supervision, we must err on the side of caution. The stakes of this engagement is far too dire to let feelings and peacetime ethics cloud the reality of the situation. And that is why Guantanamo Bay must remain open.